They said the most dangerous place in Havern was not the battlefield, not the execution ground, and not the frozen border where soldiers vanished beneath winter storms. It was the Northern Palace. That was where Alpha King Miho lived. Not rested, not ruled peacefully. Lived if the cold silence around him could be called living at all. In the Empire of Havern, Miho's name was never spoken lightly. Servants lowered their voices when they mentioned him. Ministers straightened their backs when his footsteps echoed through the throne hall. Noble families smiled before him and trembled after he turned away. They called him a blood-soaked king, a cursed alpha, a ruler whose temper could turn a banquet into a funeral. Some whispered that the royal bloodline had gone wrong in him. Others said his pheromone had been poisoned by heaven itself, twisting him into something too dangerous to be touched. Wooby had heard all of those rumors before he entered the palace gates. He simply did not believe all of them. Rumors were weapons. Wooby knew that better than most people, because he had been raised by people who made weapons out of everything. Lies. Fear. Loyalty. Hunger. Even kindness, if it could get someone close enough to kill. To the palace officials, Wooby was only one of the new Omega servants brought into the Northern Palace after the last group had begged to be transferred. He looked quiet, obedient, and weak enough to be ignored. His pheromone was so faint that several attendants barely noticed him standing in line. One older servant clicked his tongue after walking past him. Another useless one. Don't faint if His Majesty looks at you. Wooby lowered his eyes and said nothing. That was what he was supposed to do. A nobody Omega survived by becoming part of the wall, part of the floor, part of the silence. No one questioned a servant who bowed properly and moved quietly. No one wondered why his hands were steady while others shook. No one looked closely enough to notice that he counted exits before furniture, guards before decorations, blades before faces. And no one in the palace knew the truth. Wooby was not sent to serve Alpha King Miho. He was sent to kill him. The order had come from Noxa, the secret organization that had raised him since childhood. They called themselves protectors of balance, but Wooby had learned long ago that beautiful words usually covered ugly work. Noxa moved through courts and battlefields like smoke. Kings died when they became inconvenient. Generals changed sides after private visits. Entire noble houses collapsed after one sealed letter reached the wrong hand. Wooby was one of their quietest knives. His mission was simple. Enter the palace as a servant. Earn access to the king's private quarters. Wait until the grand moon right in 3 months, when Miho would stand before the sacred altar with fewer guards than usual. Then end the reign of Havern's cursed Alpha King. Wooby had repeated the mission in his mind so many times it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like breathing. That morning, the new servants were brought into the outer hall of the Northern Palace. The building was colder than the rest of the royal compound, not because of the weather, but because no one inside seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Armed royal guards lined the walls. Senior attendants stood rigid near the entrance, watching for mistakes. The chief steward, Lord Ishan, inspected the new servants with the expression of a man already disappointed. Listen carefully, he said. You will not speak to His Majesty unless spoken to first. You will not look directly at him. You will not enter the inner chambers without permission. If His Majesty dismisses you, you leave immediately. If His Majesty becomes displeased, you do not argue, cry, or beg. You lower your head and pray he forgets you exist. Several servants swallowed nervously. Wooby kept his hands folded and his breathing even. Lord Ishan's gaze stopped on him. You. Name. Wooby. No family name? None that matters, my lord. A few servants gave quiet, nervous laughs. Lord Ishan did not laugh. He looked at Wooby for another second, as if deciding whether that answer was insolent or simply empty. Then he moved on. The doors at the far end of the hall opened before he could speak again. Every sound died. The change in the air came first. It pressed down through the room, heavy and controlled, the kind of alpha presence that made instinct move before thought. One servant immediately dropped to his knees. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, nearly everyone in the hall was bowing with their heads lowered to the polished floor. Wooby lowered himself with them, but not fast enough to look panicked. Then Alpha King Miho entered. He walked without hurry, dressed in formal black royal robes embroidered with subtle silver thread. No crown sat on his head, but he did not need one. Power moved with him more clearly than gold ever could. 2 guards followed several steps behind, but their presence felt unnecessary. The entire hall seemed to bend around him. Wooby kept his gaze lowered. He felt the alpha pressure brush over his skin, sharp enough to make most omegas tremble. The suppressor in his blood dulled the worst of the reaction, but it did not remove everything. His throat tightened. His pulse slowed instead of rising. Do not react. Do not stand out. Do not look. Miho stopped in front of the kneeling servants. No one moved. Lord Ishan bowed deeply. Your Majesty, these are the new servants assigned to the Northern Palace. Silence followed. It stretched long enough for fear to become visible. Someone beside Wooby began shaking. Another servant's breath turned uneven, almost a whimper. Miho's voice was low when he finally spoke. Most of them will leave within a week. Lord Ishan lowered his head further. We will train them strictly, Your Majesty. That was not reassurance. No one dared respond. Wooby should have kept his head down. He knew that. He had survived worse rooms by obeying simpler rules. But instinct, the dangerous old kind trained into him since childhood, moved before caution. He lifted his eyes. Only for a few seconds. Miho was already looking at him. The moment their gazes met, Wooby felt the room narrow. The king's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Not of Wooby's face. Of what hid behind it. Wooby lowered his gaze immediately, but it was too late. Miho stepped closer. The servants around Wooby stiffened as if death itself had walked into their row. Lord Ishan looked confused, then alarmed. Miho stopped directly before Wooby. What is your name? Wooby bowed lower. Wooby, Your Majesty. You looked at me. I apologize, Your Majesty. Were you not afraid? A careful answer would have been yes. A safe answer would have been silence. But Wooby knew men like Miho did not believe safe answers. I was afraid, he said softly. I simply did not think fear would help me serve better. The hall froze. Lord Ishan's face went pale. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Miho gave the faintest sound, not quite amusement, not quite approval. You speak calmly for someone standing too close to danger. Wooby kept his head bowed. I have been close to danger before. That was the first mistake. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. Miho studied him for a long, unbearable second. Then his gaze shifted to Lord Ishan. Keep this Omega in the inner palace. Lord Ishan looked startled. Your Majesty? Miho did not look away from Wooby. He will serve near my study. A cold weight settled in Wooby's chest. This was good. Too good. Access to the king's study meant access to his schedule, his habits, his guards, his weakest hours. Noxa would have called it fortune. But as Miho turned and walked away, Wooby realized something unsettling. He had not successfully entered the king's shadow. The king had pulled him there. And just before Miho disappeared beyond the inner doors, he spoke without turning back. Watch him carefully. Quiet things are rarely harmless. Wooby remained kneeling among the terrified servants, his face calm, his hands still, and his mission suddenly much closer than it should have been. For the first time since entering Haven's palace, he wondered whether he was hunting the king, or whether the king had already begun hunting him. Wooby quickly realized that living beside Alpha King Miho was far more dangerous than trying to kill him. The Northern Palace did not feel like a royal residence where a king rested peacefully after governing his empire. It felt like a fortress built around a wounded predator that trusted absolutely no one. Servants moved quietly through long black corridors lined with armed royal guards. Ministers entered meetings with stiff expressions and left looking 10 years older. And every night the palace became so silent that even the sound of distant footsteps seemed intrusive. Yet the strangest part was Miho himself. The king who terrified half the empire rarely raised his voice, rarely showed anger openly, and almost never wasted words unnecessarily. He ruled through pressure alone, the kind that settled over every room before he even entered it. For the first few days, Wooby remained cautious. Being assigned near the king's private study had given him more access than he expected this early, but it also placed him directly beneath Miho's attention. That was the dangerous part. Most targets never truly looked at the servants around them. Kings especially tended to treat attendants like moving furniture. Miho did the opposite. He noticed everything. If a servant's hands trembled while pouring tea, Miho noticed. If guards changed positions outside the study, Miho noticed. Once, during an evening meeting with military officials, one minister accidentally referred to a border commander by the wrong title. Miho corrected him immediately without even looking up from the documents in his hands. Nothing escaped him. That alone should have made Wooby more careful. But what unsettled him most was the growing realization that the rumors surrounding the king were incomplete. Cruel, yes. Ruthless, absolutely. But insane? Not in the way people described. One afternoon while organizing scrolls in the study, Wooby overheard two ministers arguing quietly after Miho dismissed them from a council meeting. His Majesty should have executed the entire family, one of them muttered bitterly. He already showed mercy by sparing the children. The second minister lowered his voice immediately after noticing Wooby nearby, but the conversation lingered in Wooby's thoughts long after they left. Later that evening, curiosity pushed him to search through the records stacked carelessly near the king's desk. The noble family in question had not been executed for opposing Miho politically. They had been caught selling military grain to foreign raiders during winter while villages inside Havern starved. That was the first crack in the image Wooby had built of Miho. The second came at night. Wooby had been assigned sleeping quarters close to the inner study, so he could answer summons quickly. Around midnight, while the palace remained buried in silence, he woke to the sound of something shattering somewhere deeper inside the royal chambers. Instantly alert, Wooby sat up and listened carefully. Another crash followed, louder this time, along with uneven breathing that sounded dangerously strained. A moment later, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Two royal attendants rushed past his room looking pale. "It's happening again," one whispered fearfully. "Get the physician." The second servant shook his head immediately. The last physician left bleeding. Neither noticed Wooby watching from the partially opened doorway. Without thinking too long about the decision, Wooby followed the noise toward the inner chambers. The guards stationed outside Miho's private room looked tense enough to draw blades on shadows. One of them immediately stepped in front of Wooby. "No servants allowed." Before Wooby could answer, another violent sound came from inside the chamber, followed by a low growl that did not sound entirely human. The guards visibly flinched. Wooby understood then that the rumors about Miho losing control were true, at least partly. Whatever poison or pheromone sickness lived inside the king was real enough to terrify trained royal guards. Then Miho's voice came from inside the room, rough and dangerous. "Get out!" No one moved. Another wave of alpha pheromones burst through the chamber doors hard enough to make one young guard nearly collapse to his knees. Even Wooby felt it claw across his skin despite the suppressors buried deep in his system. It was violent, unstable, and filled with pain sharp enough to make the air itself feel heavy. The older guard cursed under his breath. "His Majesty hasn't slept in 3 days." Wooby looked toward the closed doors. This was the perfect chance. Miho was vulnerable, isolated, and barely in control. One blade placed correctly would complete the mission before the grand moon right even arrived. Instead, Wooby heard himself ask quietly, "Has anyone tried calming him?" The guards stared at him like he had lost his mind. "You think an Omega servant can calm the king?" one snapped. Wooby ignored the insult. His mind had already shifted into calculation. Noxa trained assassins to read weakness, and what he sensed inside that chamber no longer felt like madness. It felt like suffering. Before either guard could stop him, Wooby pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The room looked half destroyed. A table had been overturned near the fireplace, broken glass covered the floor, and several heavy curtains had been ripped partially from the walls. Miho stood near the far side of the chamber breathing unevenly, one hand braced against the edge of a cabinet hard enough that the wood had cracked beneath his grip. His royal robes hung loose and disordered, dark strands of hair falling across his forehead, while unstable pheromones flooded the room violently enough to make most Omegas collapse. Yet even like this, Miho still looked terrifying. The king's eyes locked onto Wooby immediately. "I told them to leave." His voice sounded strained, rougher than usual. Wooby shut the doors behind him carefully. "They were afraid to enter." "And you are not?" Miho asked. Wooby stepped closer despite every instinct warning him not to. Fear does not disappear simply because someone stronger is suffering. The silence that followed stretched dangerously long. Miho stared at him with an expression Wooby could not fully read, something caught between suspicion and exhaustion. Then another sharp wave of pain visibly hit him. His entire body tensed as his breathing grew uneven again. Wooby moved before thinking further. He grabbed a wet cloth from the overturned basin nearby and approached slowly enough not to trigger another reaction. Every step felt dangerous. One wrong movement, and Miho could kill him instantly. But when Wooby finally reached him, the king did not strike. He only stood there breathing hard while Wooby pressed the cool cloth gently against the side of his neck where the pheromone veins beneath the skin had darkened unnaturally. For the first time since entering the room, Miho went still. The change happened gradually. The unstable pheromones stopped lashing violently through the chamber. His breathing slowed slightly. The tension in his shoulders loosened just enough for Wooby to realize how exhausted he truly was beneath all that power. Miho lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again, quieter this time. "What exactly are you?" Wooby's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. "A servant." Miho let out a faint breath that almost sounded amused despite the pain. "That was not the answer I asked for." Hours passed quietly after that. Wooby remained beside him while the storm inside the king slowly calmed. Neither spoke much. At some point near dawn, Miho finally drifted into exhausted sleep against the headboard behind him. Wooby stared at him for a long moment in silence. This was the man the Empire feared like a monster. Yet right now, asleep beneath dim candlelight with dark circles beneath his eyes, Miho looked less like a tyrant and more like someone who had been fighting alone for far too long. Wooby carefully stood to leave before the servants outside realized he was still alive. But the moment he turned toward the door, strong fingers suddenly wrapped around his wrist. Miho's eyes were half open, heavy with exhaustion but still sharp enough to pin Wooby in place. "Tell me something honestly," the king murmured quietly. "Did you enter this palace to save me or to destroy me?" And for the first time since accepting the mission from Noxa, Wooby realized he no longer knew the answer himself. After the night inside the royal chambers, something inside the northern palace quietly changed. The servants noticed it first. Alpha King Miho still ruled with the same cold authority, still terrified ministers into silence during council meetings, and still executed corrupt nobles without hesitation. Yet his attention had begun drifting toward one specific Omega often enough for rumors to spread through the palace faster than winter wind. Wooby was no longer treated like an invisible servant. Guards stepped aside when he entered the inner study. Royal attendants stopped assigning him meaningless chores. Even Lord Ishan, who normally criticized everyone, had started watching Wooby with cautious restraint instead of annoyance. Nobody understood exactly what had happened inside Miho's chambers that night, but everyone understood one dangerous fact. The king had allowed an Omega to remain beside him during one of his episodes, and that Omega had walked out alive. Wooby himself tried not to think about it too much. That had become increasingly difficult because Miho kept pulling him closer without openly admitting it. Sometimes the king would summon him late at night under the excuse of needing tea or documents reorganized, only to continue working in silence while Wooby sat nearby sorting military reports beside the fire. Other nights Miho simply seemed calmer when Wooby was in the room. The unstable edge inside his pheromones softened almost unconsciously whenever the Omega approached, and the king had started noticing it too. That realization made things more dangerous than either of them openly acknowledged. One evening, while Wooby arranged scrolls near the large windows of the study, Miho suddenly spoke without looking up from the report in his hands. "You never ask questions." Wooby glanced toward him carefully. "Would your majesty answer them if I did?" Miho's mouth almost twitched upward. "Probably not." The silence afterward felt strangely comfortable. That was the problem. Wooby had spent his entire life trained to manipulate trust, not experience it. Yet lately, moments inside the northern palace had started feeling dangerously close to peace. The shift became impossible to ignore after the winter banquet. The grand hall overflowed with nobles, military commanders, royal advisors, and powerful alpha families draped in silk and jewels. Music echoed softly through the enormous chamber, while servants carried silver trays between crowded tables beneath glittering lanterns. Wooby remained several steps behind Miho's throne platform as expected of a royal attendant, but the moment the king entered beside him, whispers spread immediately across the hall. Every noble in Havern had heard rumors by now about the Omega from the northern palace. Some looked curious. Others looked openly offended. One Omega noble in particular did not bother hiding his contempt. Lord Seorian was beautiful in the polished, expensive way noble families valued, with elegant robes and the sharp confidence of someone raised believing alphas would always bend toward him eventually. Rumors throughout the capital claimed Seorian's family had once hoped he would become Miho's royal consort. Judging from the look in his eyes when he noticed Wooby standing beside the throne, those ambitions had clearly not disappeared. The banquet proceeded tensely for nearly an hour before Seorian finally approached during a break in the political discussions. "Your Majesty," he greeted smoothly, bowing with practiced elegance. "The capital has become quite lively lately. Everyone seems fascinated by your new servant." Miho barely glanced at him. "People in this palace are too interested in matters unrelated to survival." Seorian smiled faintly before turning his attention toward Woobi. "I confess," he said softly, "I expected someone more impressive." Several nearby nobles immediately pretended not to listen. Woobi lowered his gaze respectfully. "Then I apologize for disappointing you." A few nobles hid quiet amusement behind wine cups. Seorian's smile tightened slightly. "You speak boldly for a servant." "I speak carefully," Woobi corrected calmly. The tension around them sharpened instantly. Miho still sat lazily against the throne platform, but Woobi noticed his attention had shifted completely toward the conversation. Then Seorian made his mistake. The noble Omega released a subtle wave of pheromones directly toward Woobi, sweet and sharp beneath the heavy scent of incense filling the hall. Most people nearby probably would not notice it consciously, but Woobi recognized the tactic immediately. It was humiliation disguised as instinct, a deliberate attempt to pressure a weaker Omega into discomfort before the entire court. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. But years of suppressors and assassin training had dulled Woobi's reactions far beyond ordinary Omega instincts. Instead of shrinking back, Woobi simply looked mildly annoyed. That reaction only angered Seorian further. The pheromone pressure intensified enough for several nearby attendants to shift uneasily. One noble alpha frowned immediately. Another glanced nervously toward the throne. And then the entire hall went silent. Miho stood. The pressure that rolled through the banquet chamber instantly crushed every other scent beneath it. Several nobles visibly stiffened while servants lowered their heads in panic. Miho descended the throne steps slowly, expression calm in the most dangerous possible way. Seorian paled immediately. "Your Majesty, I was only—" Miho grabbed him by the throat before he could finish. Gasps exploded across the hall. The king slammed Seorian backward hard enough to rattle the nearest table, while the noble Omega clawed weakly at Miho's wrist in shock. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Miho's voice remained terrifyingly quiet. "You released pheromones against someone standing under my protection." Seorian's face had already gone pale from fear. "I meant no disrespect." "Then your instincts are poorly trained." The alpha pressure filling the hall grew heavier. Woobi could actually hear several nobles stepping backward. Miho leaned slightly closer to Seorian, eyes cold enough to freeze the air itself. "If you embarrass him again, I will bury your entire bloodline beside you." The silence afterward felt suffocating. Miho finally released Seorian, letting him stumble backward in humiliation before turning away like the noble no longer mattered. Then, in front of the entire royal court, Miho stopped beside Woobi and rested one hand lightly against the back of his neck possessively enough for everyone in the hall to understand the message immediately. "No one touches him." Woobi felt dozens of shocked eyes lock onto him at once, but the most dangerous part was not the public attention. It was the unfamiliar warmth spreading slowly through his chest beneath Miho's hand. That night, long after the banquet ended, Woobi slipped quietly through hidden corridors beneath the palace to meet a masked figure waiting inside an abandoned shrine near the outer wall. The assassin standing there wore the silver thread insignia of Nox's upper ranks. "You're getting distracted," the man said coldly. Woobi remained silent. The assassin stepped closer before speaking again. "Do you even know who poisoned Miho in the first place?" Woobi's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you talking about?" The masked man let out a humorless laugh. "Your king was never cursed. Noxa poisoned him years ago, so the Empire would fear him enough to become controllable." For the first time in years, genuine shock cracked through Woobi's composure. And far above them inside the sleeping northern palace, Alpha King Miho stood alone near the study windows holding the dagger Woobi had accidentally left behind earlier that evening, his eyes fixed on the assassin insignia carved into the blade's handle. After discovering the truth about Nox's involvement in poisoning Miho, Woobi stopped sleeping properly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image repeating inside his mind. Miho alone in the dark study with exhaustion hidden behind cold authority, forcing himself to remain standing while the Empire called him a monster. For years Woobi had believed he was entering the Northern Palace to kill a tyrant. Now every piece of that belief was beginning to rot beneath him. The most dangerous part was not the guilt. It was the growing realization that Miho already knew far more than he should. The dagger Wooby left behind disappeared from his room the same night he returned from the abandoned shrine. No servants mentioned it. No guards questioned him. But the following morning, when Wooby entered the study carrying fresh tea, he noticed the dagger resting silently beside Miho's documents like a deliberate warning. The assassin insignia carved into the handle faced upward clearly enough for anyone to recognize if they knew what they were looking for. Miho did not mention it immediately. That somehow felt worse. The king continued reading reports while snow drifted heavily beyond the tall palace windows. "You move differently lately," he said calmly after several minutes of silence. Wooby kept his expression neutral while setting down the tea tray. "Your Majesty notices too much." Miho finally looked up. "That was never hidden from you." Their eyes met briefly before Wooby lowered his gaze first. The tension between them had changed ever since the winter banquet. It no longer felt like suspicion alone. Something more dangerous existed beneath it now, something neither of them knew how to name without destroying the fragile balance holding them together. That evening the storm arrived. Heavy snow buried the outer courtyards while violent wind shook the palace lanterns hard enough to extinguish several flames along the northern walls. Most servants hurried indoors early, and even the royal guards looked tense while rotating positions near the inner palace gates. Wooby sensed the shift almost immediately. The atmosphere inside the northern palace felt wrong. Too quiet. Too controlled. Assassins loved storms because bad weather swallowed noise, slowed reinforcements, and turned fear into confusion. Wooby was halfway through reorganizing military reports inside the study when every lantern in the palace suddenly died at once. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. A heartbeat later, screams echoed somewhere far down the corridor. Miho stood immediately. Not startled. Ready. The king's sword was already in his hand before the second scream finished. "Stay behind me," he ordered coldly. Wooby ignored the command and moved toward the window instead. Outside, parts of the northern palace were burning faintly beneath the snowstorm, while armed figures dressed in black crossed the outer courtyard walls with terrifying coordination. Noxa had finally come openly. The study doors burst inward seconds later. A royal guard stumbled inside, clutching his bleeding throat before collapsing across the floor. Behind him came two masked assassins moving fast enough to kill before ordinary soldiers could react. Miho met them head-on without hesitation. Steel crashed violently through the darkness, while shattered lantern glass rolled across the floor beneath their feet. Wooby stepped back automatically at first, forcing himself to maintain the image of a frightened servant while Miho fought. That had always been the mission. Stay hidden. Survive long enough to strike at the right moment. Then a third assassin appeared behind Miho. Wooby saw the blade descending before the king did. His body moved before thought caught up. The hidden knife inside Wooby's sleeve slid into his hand instantly as he crossed the room in silence. One sharp movement drove the blade directly through the assassin's throat before the man could complete the strike. Blood sprayed hot across Wooby's wrist. The body hit the floor heavily. Silence followed for one stunned second. Miho turned toward him immediately. Their eyes locked. And in that moment, the lie shattered completely. Wooby was no helpless Omega servant. The remaining assassins recognized him instantly. "Traitor!" one hissed beneath his mask. That single word destroyed any chance of hiding the truth further. More footsteps thundered through the corridor outside as additional assassins flooded toward the study. Miho grabbed Wooby's wrist roughly and pulled him backward just as a crossbow bolt exploded through the doorway where his head had been moments earlier. "Move!" Miho ordered sharply. The next few minutes dissolved into chaos. The northern palace became a battlefield buried beneath snow and darkness, while flames spread across shattered hallways. Royal guards fought desperately through the corridors, but Noxa had planned the attack too carefully. They were not here merely to assassinate the king anymore. They were here to erase the royal bloodline completely. Wooby and Miho retreated deeper into the inner palace, while assassins hunted them through collapsing corridors. Somewhere along the way Miho took a blade across his side, while shielding Wooby from another ambush. The sight of blood soaking through the king's robes snapped something inside Wooby hard enough to hurt. For years Noxa had taught him one lesson above all others. Kings were tools. If necessary, they died. But watching Miho bleed because of him filled Wooby with something terrifyingly close to panic. The final confrontation erupted inside the ruined Grand Hall of the Northern Palace. Snow blew violently through shattered windows while dead guards and assassins covered the marble floor. More enemies surrounded them from every direction. Miho still stood despite the blood loss, sword clenched tightly enough for blood to drip from his palm. But even Woobi could see the poison inside the king beginning to destabilize his pheromones again. Then the assassins charged together. And Woobi stopped pretending entirely. The Omega moved through the battlefield like something born from the storm itself. His hidden blades flashed silver through the darkness, while bodies collapsed one after another before they fully understood what they were facing. One assassin lost his throat. Another crashed backward through shattered pillars. A third barely managed to scream before Woobi buried a blade beneath his jaw. Miho watched everything. The precision. The calmness. The terrifying efficiency. This was not a servant defending himself desperately. This was a weapon trained for years to kill kings. When the final assassin finally collapsed into the blood-covered snow, silence slowly returned to the ruined hall except for the distant sound of fire and wind. Woobi stood breathing unevenly among the corpses, blood staining his robes while snow melted slowly against his skin. Miho stared at him for a long moment before speaking quietly. "How many times did you think about killing me?" Woobi's chest tightened painfully. "Many." The king stepped closer despite the sword still hanging from Woobi's blood-stained hand. "Then why didn't you?" Snow drifted between them while flames crackled somewhere behind the broken pillars. Woobi looked at Miho's wound, then at the exhaustion hidden beneath his cold expression, and finally answered with frightening honesty. "Because I stopped wanting you dead." Something shifted in Miho's eyes instantly. The king reached up slowly, fingers stained with blood as they touched Woobi's face carefully enough to feel unreal. Then Miho pulled him forward and kissed him. Not gently. Not softly. The kiss felt like relief dragged through fear and exhaustion, like two people standing in the ruins of everything they believed trying desperately to hold onto something still alive. Woobi's fingers tightened instinctively against Miho's robes while the king's hand pressed firmly against the back of his neck possessively enough to make his pulse stumble hard. And then Woobi ruined it. The moment the kiss broke, he stepped backward, pulled a hidden blade from his sleeve, and pressed it against Miho's throat just as surviving royal guards burst into the ruined hall. The entire palace froze. Woobi's expression turned cold again as he said quietly, "I was never on your side, your majesty." But the hand holding the blade was trembling. The moment Woobi pressed the blade against Alpha King Miho's throat, the entire ruined hall fell into absolute silence. Snow continued blowing violently through shattered windows while surviving royal guards froze in shock around them, unable to understand how the weak Omega servant standing beside the king had suddenly transformed into the blood-covered assassin responsible for half the bodies scattered across the marble floor. Several guards immediately raised their weapons toward Woobi, but none of them dared move closer because Miho had not given the order. That was the part terrifying everyone most. The king was not fighting back. Woobi forced his expression to remain cold, even while his pulse hammered painfully beneath his ribs. This was the only way left. Naxa already suspected his loyalty. If he did not fully commit to the lie now, both he and Miho would die before dawn. Slowly, carefully, Woobi stepped backward while keeping the blade near Miho's throat. "No one follows me," he said quietly, "or the king dies here." One younger guard immediately snarled and started forward before Miho lifted one hand slightly without taking his eyes off Woobi. The guard stopped instantly. The silence between them felt unbearable. Miho's dark robes were soaked with blood from the wound along his side, yet his expression remained terrifyingly calm. He looked at Woobi the same way he always had, directly enough to make lying feel impossible. "If you leave now," the king said quietly, "you won't be able to return." The words nearly shattered Woobi's composure completely because there was no hatred in them. No rage. Only something dangerously close to disappointment. Woobi tightened his grip around the knife hard enough for his fingers to ache. "I was sent here to kill you," he answered coldly. "Do not pretend you expected anything else." Then before his resolve could fail him entirely, Woobi disappeared into the storm. By sunrise, the entire capital knew the truth. The mysterious Omega beside Alpha King Miho had been an assassin all along. Rumors spread through Havern faster than fire through dry grass. Some claimed Woobi had bewitched the king. Others insisted Miho had grown weak because of an Omega. Noble families who already feared the king immediately seized the opportunity to push their own agendas. Ministers demanded arrests. Military officials demanded executions. The royal court exploded into chaos within hours. And through all of it, Miho said almost nothing. That silence frightened everyone more than rage would have. 3 days later, the emergency royal council gathered inside the throne hall beneath heavy storm clouds hanging over the capital. Ministers argued openly while military commanders demanded permission to hunt Woobi across the empire. One older noble slammed his hand against the council table furiously. The assassin stood beside your majesty for months. The palace guards failed. The northern palace nearly fell. This disgrace cannot go unanswered. Another minister nodded quickly. If the empire learns your majesty allowed a Noxa assassin near the throne willingly, rebellion will spread. Miho listened to the shouting from the throne without visible emotion. Dark exhaustion lingered beneath his eyes after days without proper rest, but his posture remained perfectly straight. Finally, Lord Seangram stepped forward carefully. Your majesty, he said cautiously, for the stability of Havern, the assassin must be publicly executed. The throne hall went silent. Everyone waited for Miho's answer. The king spoke slowly. Bring me proof that Woobi betrayed Havern itself. Confusion spread immediately across several ministers' faces. Lord Seangram frowned. Your majesty, he held a blade to your throat. And he had many opportunities to kill me before that, Miho replied calmly. Yet I remain alive. Nobody dared answer. The implication hanging beneath his words felt too dangerous to acknowledge openly. Meanwhile, far beyond the capital walls, Woobi knelt inside an abandoned fortress hidden deep within the frozen mountains bordering Havern. The stronghold belonged to Noxa, and every corridor inside it smelled faintly of blood, smoke, and old death. Masked assassins watched him carefully while whispers followed him through the halls. Some viewed him with suspicion, others with amusement. One wrong step, and his own organization would cut his throat before nightfall. At the center of the fortress waited the leader of Noxa. The man known only as Master Black Veil sat behind a long table covered in maps and sealed reports, his face hidden beneath layers of dark fabric embroidered with silver thread. You took too long, he said quietly as Woobi approached. Woobi lowered his gaze. Miho is harder to kill than expected. A low laugh echoed through the chamber. No, Black Veil corrected softly. You simply stopped wanting him dead. The room went still. Woobi's fingers curled slightly against his sleeves, but he forced his expression not to change. Black Veil studied him for several long seconds before continuing. Do you know why we chose you for this mission? Woobi remained silent. Because your pheromones calm him, the leader said. Even poisoned alphas still react to instinct. You were shaped specifically to become his weakness. Something cold twisted inside Woobi's chest. Before he could answer, another assassin entered the chamber hurriedly and dropped to one knee. Your Majesty Miho has mobilized royal troops near the eastern passes. Black Veil smiled slowly beneath the shadows hiding his face. Good, he murmured. Then the king has finally decided to chase what belongs to him. Woobi's pulse stumbled painfully at the words. Back inside Havern's capital, Miho stood alone near the palace windows overlooking the storm-covered city while royal advisors begged him to focus on the growing rebellion spreading among the nobles. He ignored most of them. His thoughts remained fixed on one thing only. Woobi leaving with trembling hands despite pretending indifference. Woobi standing in blood and snow while trying to force himself into becoming a monster again. For the first time in years, Miho realized how dangerously vulnerable he had become. Not because an assassin had reached his throat, but because the assassin had walked away with something far more important. His trust. Days later, the trap finally closed. Woobi's cover inside Noxa collapsed after one of the senior assassins discovered secret reports missing from the fortress archives. By midnight, Woobi found himself chained inside the organization's underground execution chamber, while blood from repeated beatings stained the stone floor beneath him. Black Veil stood nearby calmly watching. You disappoint me, he said softly. I thought you understood loyalty better than this. Woobi lifted his head slowly despite the pain tearing through his body. You poisoned a child and turned him into a weapon. Black Veil laughed quietly. And you fell in love with the target. That is far more pathetic. Then the chamber doors suddenly exploded open. Royal guards stormed inside first, blades drawn, followed immediately by Alpha King Miho himself stepping through the smoke, and chaos with sword in hand and murder burning visibly in his eyes. Every assassin in the chamber froze. Because the king had come personally. Not with an army. Not with generals. Himself. Black Veil's hidden smile widened slowly. Interesting, he murmured while tightening the blade resting against Woobi's throat. Then let us see what the ruler of Havern values more. His empire or one Omega. And before the entire chamber of assassins and royal guards, Alpha King Miho slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The entire underground chamber fell into stunned silence the moment Alpha King Miho lowered himself onto one knee before Noxa. Even the assassins surrounding the room looked shaken because nobody in Havern had ever witnessed the king bow to anyone. Ministers feared him. Generals obeyed him. Noble families built their lives around surviving his anger. Yet now the ruler of the empire stood in blood and smoke with his sword lowered while another man's blade rested against Wubi's throat. Wubi stared at him in disbelief. Pain still burned through his body from the beatings, but none of it compared to the crushing weight suddenly tightening inside his chest. "What are you doing?" he whispered hoarsely. Miho never looked away from Black Veil. Ending this, the leader of Noxa laughed softly beneath his mask. How disappointing. The mighty king of Havern undone by an Omega. Several assassins joined the laughter nervously, but the sound faded quickly because Miho's pheromones had already begun darkening the air around him. Rage rolled off the king in terrifying waves despite the calmness still visible on his face. Black Veil tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, your majesty, if I cut his throat right now, would you destroy this entire mountain to avenge him?" Miho answered immediately. "Yes." No hesitation. No calculation. Just truth. The room grew colder after that. Wubi shut his eyes briefly because hearing those words hurt more than the chains cutting into his wrists. His entire life had been built around one lesson. People only kept Omegas close as long as they were useful. Noxa trained him to become valuable enough to survive and emotionless enough not to care who used him. But Miho had crossed half the empire, abandoned the safety of the capital during a growing rebellion, and knelt before assassins simply to keep him alive. That realization shattered something inside Wubi completely. Black Veil finally sighed as if disappointed by the scene unfolding before him. Then perhaps it is time the king learned the final truth. He reached into his robes and dropped several old documents onto the stone floor between them. "Your precious Omega was never naturally born capable of calming your pheromones," he said softly. "We made him that way." Wubi's breathing stopped. Miho's eyes darkened immediately. Black Veil continued calmly while the chamber remained silent around him. "After poisoning you as a child, we spent years searching for a method to control the instability inside your bloodline. Most experiments failed. Most Omegas died." His gaze shifted toward Wubi. But this one survived. The chains around Wubi suddenly felt unbearable. Black Veil's voice remained smooth and cruel. His pheromones were altered specifically to suppress violent alpha responses. From the beginning, he was designed to become your leash. The chamber stayed deathly quiet after that revelation. Wubi stared down at the floor while nausea twisted through him hard enough to make breathing painful. Suddenly every moment beside Miho felt poisoned. Every quiet night in the study. Every time Miho calmed near him. Every touch. Every kiss. Maybe none of it had ever been real. Wubi let out a broken laugh beneath his breath. "So even this wasn't mine." Miho's expression changed instantly. "Do not say that." Wubi finally looked at him, eyes filled with something dangerously close to despair. "You calmed down because I was made to control you." "No," Miho said immediately. "I chose you long before I understood any of this." Black Veil smiled beneath his mask. "Did you? Or did instinct simply guide you exactly where we wanted?" That was the final mistake. The moment Black Veil finished speaking, Wubi moved. The hidden blade he had concealed inside his sleeve for emergencies slid into his palm as he twisted violently against the assassin restraining him. Before anyone fully reacted, Wubi drove the blade backward directly through the man's throat and ripped himself free from the chains. Chaos exploded through the chamber instantly. Assassins lunged forward while royal guards crashed into them from the entrance. Steel clashed violently through smoke and torchlight as the underground fortress turned into a battlefield. Miho reached Wubi within seconds, grabbing him hard enough to steady both of them. "Can you stand?" Wubi nodded once despite blood running from the corner of his mouth. "Then stay behind me." Wubi almost laughed at that because they both knew he never stayed behind anyone. The next minutes dissolved into violence. Royal guards fought through narrow corridors while Noxa assassins flooded the fortress from every direction. Somewhere above them, the mountain stronghold had already begun collapsing under the attack from Miho's soldiers outside. At the center of the chaos stood Black Veil. The leader of Noxa moved with terrifying precision, cutting through guards fast enough to leave bodies collapsing across the stone floor. Wooby recognized the style immediately because he had been trained in the same techniques since childhood. Every movement Black Veil made felt like watching the shadow of what Wooby himself could have become if he had never entered the Northern Palace. Their final fight erupted inside the burning central shrine of the fortress, while flames spread rapidly through the collapsing ceiling above them. Wooby fought harder than he ever had before, because this battle was no longer about missions or survival. It was about ending the thing that had stolen his entire life. Black Veil's blade sliced across Wooby's shoulder before Wooby drove his own knife deep into the man's side. Blood splattered across the burning altar between them. Then Black Veil smiled. "You still became exactly what we made you," he whispered. Wooby's grip tightened painfully around the blade. "No," he answered quietly. "I became someone who chose for himself." And with that, he drove the knife directly into Black Veil's throat. The leader of Noxa collapsed at last. But victory lasted only seconds. Another assassin emerged from the smoke behind Miho with a sword already descending toward the king's back. Wooby moved without thinking. Steel tore through his side violently as he stepped between them, taking the strike himself before collapsing hard against Miho's chest. Everything after that happened too fast. Miho caught Wooby before he hit the ground, and for one horrifying second the king simply stared at the blood spreading rapidly through the Omega's robes. Then something inside him finally snapped. The pheromones exploding through the shrine became monstrous. Royal guards froze. Remaining assassins panicked instantly. Miho no longer looked human beneath the firelight. Rage and terror twisted together violently inside him, while he handed Wooby carefully to one of the guards before turning back toward the surviving enemies. What followed was not a battle. It was slaughter. By the time the fires finally died, Noxa no longer existed. Weeks passed after the war ended. Havern slowly stabilized beneath Miho's rule, while the surviving noble families abandoned their rebellion one by one. But inside the Northern Palace, the king himself became quieter than ever. Wooby disappeared after recovering from his injuries, leaving the palace before dawn without saying goodbye. Miho did not stop him. He did not send guards after him either. Every night afterward, however, the lanterns inside the Northern Palace remained lit until morning, as if someone was still expected to return. Then winter came again. Snow drifted softly across the palace gardens the night Wooby finally stepped back into the study. Miho sat alone near the fire reading reports beneath dim candlelight, but the moment the doors opened, his attention lifted immediately. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Wooby looked thinner than before, the scar along his side still visible beneath dark robes, but his eyes no longer carried the emptiness they once had. Finally, Wooby walked closer and asked quietly, "Does your majesty still want an Omega like me beside him?" Miho stood slowly before crossing the room toward him. "I never wanted a weapon," he answered softly. "I wanted you." Wooby's breath caught unevenly at the words. Then Miho touched his face carefully like someone afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too quickly. This time when Wooby leaned forward first, there was no mission, no lies, and no blood between them anymore. Only choice. Several days later, before the entire royal court of Havern, Alpha King Miho publicly marked Wooby as his chosen partner. Ministers looked stunned. Nobles looked terrified. But Wooby simply stood beside the king calmly, while Miho's hand remained firmly wrapped around his own. Because in the end, the assassin sent to destroy the king had become the only person capable of teaching him how to live like a man instead of a monster. And that was the story of the assassin Omega who entered Havern's palace to kill a king, only to become the one person the feared Alpha King could never lose. If you enjoyed this dark ABO royal romance, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for more emotional fantasy love stories next time.